Today, we're going to look at human evolution, the Ape-Man, these missing links that we call Ape-Man that are used by evolutionists to prove that humans have evolved from ape-like ancestors. Now, this is a really hot-button issue, big-time hot-button issue. Discoveries made in this field almost immediately make it onto the front page. You discover something or claim to have discovered something that adds something new to the picture of human evolution. You claim that you have found some new fossil that forces them to rewrite their version of human history a little bit. Boom, your front page news. Front page. And the problem with this is that anything that makes it onto the front page of your popular media and such makes its way into the classroom. Oftentimes these same discoveries, these same claims are turned over later. They're retracted later. But the retractions never make it in the classroom. And this is one of the subjects that has convinced a great many Christians that evolution must be true. This subject right here, much like the fossil record. But when, there are a lot of people that could accept a quantity of evolution. I certainly can. I realize that God has created organisms with an ability to adapt. That's just amazing. Amazing ability to adapt. And that adaptation process involves the production of a great many separate species from within these biblical kinds. Tremendous differences can be seen. I could term that evolution. So a lot of people can accept a quantity of evolution. But understand that Darwin's theory, Darwinism itself, led inexorably to the conclusion that humans are part of that process as well. That we were the end result of this evolutionary process, that we have evolved from ape-like ancestors, that we are just another animal. This was an inexorable conclusion of Darwin's seminal theory. And when people saw credible evidence that humans appeared to have evolved from apes, when people saw credible evidence of that aspect of evolution, that was it. If we've evolved from animals, then the entire theory of evolution must be true. To some people, that was it. That was the one key factor that caused them to buy in all the way. Evolution must be true if we've evolved from animals. But what does that do to humanity as well? What does that do? So human evolution is taught as absolute fact today. Evolution in general is taught as though it's an absolute fact. But most evolutionists will admit to you, they will tell you that evolution is both a fact and a theory. They will say it's both a fact and a theory. They say it's a fact that it has occurred. That's a fact. Evolution's a fact. It's a fact that it's occurred. We're not sure how it occurred yet, so that part's a theory, It's theoretical how it happened, but it's a fact that it did happen. And of course, this is the scientific method flipped on its head, right here. Because the scientific method starts by making a hypothesis, an educated guess to explain some physical phenomena, some process. And then you do your best to support that hypothesis with experimentation. If you can support it with experimentation, you might be able to consider your hypothesis a theory. And then if you do further experimentation on your theory, specifically if you try to falsify your theory, and if your theory cannot be falsified under any conceivable circumstances or scenarios, you might then be able to consider your theory a fact. But you start with the hypothesis. After experimentation, you end up with a theory. After more experimentations and unable to falsify your theory, you could call it a fact. But they've taken the entire scientific method, flipped it on its head. We start with the assumption it's a fact, and now we're working on the theories to see how that took place. But they teach it as an absolute fact. If you read the terminology on the descriptions of evolution, there's no, this is what we think, this might have happened, this is how it happened, period. Prentice Hall Biology, one of the most widely used biology textbooks used in U.S. public schools, summarizes human evolution this way. They say humans and other primates evolved from a common ancestor that lived more than 65 million years ago. It's not a guess. It's not what we think. It's perhaps this way, matter-of-fact terminology. Between 6 and 7 million years ago, the hominoid line gave rise to a branch that ultimately led to the ancestors and closest relatives of modern humans. It's an absolute fact. It's a fact that humans have evolved. You see these phylogenetic trees that place humans there along with all of these other primates. We are taxonomically classified as a primate. We are in the order of the primates. Kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, and order primates. We're considered a primate. But there it shows the evolutionary history proceeding from up through various apes and ultimately to humans. So humans and the apes have evolved from what they consider an ape-like ancestor. This is the view that's being taught by the scientific community, a view that's being taught as absolute fact. But of course, the Bible makes it clear that God created Adam from the dust of the ground and in his own image, that we are the pinnacle of God's creation, that all of this was made just for us, to have a world for us. When I consider your heavens, the works of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the Son of Man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God and crowned him with glory and majesty. That is what we are. We're not just another animal. We were created in God's image, created just a little lower than God to rule over his creation, over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air. In God's own image we were created. And God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps along the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. The Bible is clear on these things. The Bible also gives us a genealogical record that allows us to calculate how old the earth is. A genealogical record. You can easily, through simple addition, add the dates at which the patriarchs gave birth to their first son and calculate the date at which the flood took place. Through simple addition. The Bible gives us enough chronological information to where we can calculate how old the earth is. And it's far less than what the scientific community assesses, far less than the 4.6 billion years that they say the earth has been here. And life has been evolving. The question we got to ask ourselves is, can we reconcile what the scientific community is teaching with the Bible? Can we reconcile the Bible with evolution? Are humans the result of an evolutionary process? Were we created unique, separate from the animals? I'd say no. I say these two views are irreconcilable. That we need to be looking at, again, at the scientific findings to see how those can be interpreted from within the biblical worldview. And I think you'll see some interesting things. Some interesting things. And we should be skeptical, very, very skeptical about what the scientific community is teaching today. Remember that the scientific community has adopted a position of naturalism. Now, not all scientists are atheists, but the majority are. The majority of your scientists today are atheists, and certainly the science that's being taught in our public school, the science that's being taught out there in our popular media sources is a science that's based on atheism. They've rejected that there is a God, rejected biblical history, and are doing their best to explain how the world came to be through purely natural processes. They hold to naturalism. And we should be very careful about accepting these things and more careful about teaching them. That we're warned in Matthew. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men. If we teach the precepts of men as doctrines, precepts like the theory of evolution, we teach these as doctrines, as their absolute fact, we are far away from me, says God. We need to be thinking scholarly disciples of Christ. Remember when Jesus was asked on two separate occasions, what is the most important of the laws? He said to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. And if you read that original quote, the original verse from Leviticus, Jesus added with all your mind to that. And it's clear what he was telling us to do, that he wanted us to be thinking scholarly disciples of Christ. And he, Christ, gave for the equipping of the saints, for the work of service, to the building up of the body of Christ. As a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness in deceitful scheming. We need to be careful judges of what we're being taught and discern the truth. There is a truth out there. There are a lot of opinions, a lot of crazy opinions about the world, but there's only one truth. You've got to remember that. There's only one truth. All right, so we want to look at human evolution. and the various evidence that's been used to support this theory. And the best way to start is to start with some history. Start with some ancient history. We're going to start with Nebraska Man. Nebraska Man was discovered, as the name might imply, in western Nebraska in 1922. Media reports of Nebraska Man flooded the classroom, and, and it was used in school textbooks for several years. It was even presented as evidence in the Scopes trial. You know the Scopes trial? The American Civil Liberties Union orchestrated a trial to challenge a act, the Butler Act, which at that point in time prohibited the teaching of human evolution in public schools. The ACLU decided to challenge that. They actually put out newspaper ads to get someone to challenge the Butler Act, so they could put on a big media circus trial, the Scopes trial. The Nebraska Man was used as evidence for evolution, to prove evolution in the Scopes trial. But what do they actually find? What was actually found that showed them what Nebraska Man looked like? See the diagram, the illustration of Nebraska Man to the left. They did not find a complete skeleton to help them know what Nebraska Man looked like. They didn't find a complete skull. They didn't even have a complete jawbone. All they found was a single molar tooth. That's it. Single molar tooth. And look how much information you can get from a single molar tooth. Not only do they know what Nebraska Man looks like, but they know what his very fetching wife there beside him looked like as well. You can get a lot of information from a tooth. Lots of information from a tooth. But after further examination, the initial claim of discovery was retracted in Scientific American 5 years later. But it took 5 years later for them to realize that what they had was did not belong to a man. It did not belong to an ape. That single molar tooth that they had found and used to reconstruct Nebraska Man and used as evidence in the Scopes trial turned out to belong to a pig, an extinct peccary. Single pig's tooth was used to support human evolution in the Scopes trial. And this is far from an isolated incident. In 1983, a dolphin rib was misidentified as a hominid bone. A dolphin rib was thought to be a hominid bone. Dr. Tim White's an anthropologist at the University of California, Berkeley, and he criticizes the claim here and humorously called the discovery Flipperpithecus. Flipperpithecus? He says, a 5 million-year-old piece of bone that was thought to be the collarbone of a human-like creature is actually part of a dolphin rib. And listen to this. He says, a problem with a lot of anthropologists, people that study humans, is that they want so much to find a hominid that any scrap of bone becomes a hominid bone. If you can misidentify a dolphin rib as a hominid bone to prove evolution, a pig's tooth to prove evolution, well, you're able to accept just about anything. But again, not an isolated incident. This has actually occurred numerous times over history. Apes have been deduced from tiny fragments of bones which actually belong to not only the pig and the dolphin as we have seen, but also alligator, horse, bear, elephants, and donkeys at some point. Nigel Hawkes, is a science correspondent and health editor for the Times newspaper in London. Nigel Hawkes says, few sciences produce such abundant returns from so few fragments of facts as paleontology, the study of ancient life. Another famous discovery, in 1911, Piltdown Man was found by an amateur fossil hunter by the name of Charles Dawson. He claimed to have found pieces of a human skull from a gravel pit in Piltdown, England, thus the name Piltdown Man. This is actually a staged photo that shows Charles Dawson digging in the gravel pits, but with a dress full, he's all dressed up to dig in his gravel pits for a Piltdown Man. In 1912, it was announced that Darwin's missing link had been found. The discovery was published in New York Times under the headline, Darwin's Theory Proved True. For 40 years, from 1912 until 1953, Piltdown Man reigned supreme as the proof of human evolution. It was presented in scores of books, pamphlets, classroom lectures. Articles were published about Piltdown Man. For 40 years, it reigned supreme. But in 1953, scientists subjected the find to chemical analysis, which eventually proved that the ape-like jawbone was of a recent origin. But it got worse. Upon close inspection, they found file marks on the teeth, which had been used to shorten them to make them look more human-like. In addition, the bones had been treated with chemicals to increase the appearance of their age. And it was quickly concluded that the jaw had been intentionally planted and bore no resemblance to a human jaw. Why did it take 40 years? From 1912 to 1953, it took 40 years before someone realized that the teeth had been filed down. And according to reports, the file marks on the teeth were so obvious, some have said that they had to be willfully ignored. Why would they willfully ignore something like that? They will stick with the evidence they have until they have something better to take its place. It's possible they were willfully ignored. Without any other evidence to support human evolution, it was allowed to stand. But it wasn't fossils that convinced most people that humans have evolved from apes, but rather carefully constructed illustrations. This is arguably one of the most famous scientific illustrations of all time. It became known as the March of Progress. It was published in a 1965 Time Life book series called Early Man. The poster that you see here folds out, was inside of one of the books, and it folded out to a 5-page spread that you see here. But the poster itself was mailed out independently as a promotional tool. It was sent to schools and libraries across the globe. As a result, the poster appeared in libraries and classrooms across the globe, even to those that didn't purchase the book series. Stephen Jay Gould, one of the most famous evolutionists of our day, even described the poster as the canonical representation of evolution, the one picture immediately grasped and viscerally understood by all. The image has been copied and modified countless times for research purposes, to parody, even Homo sapiens. March of Progress. It was a propaganda tool, a promotional tool, that convinced more people that humans have evolved from apes than any physical evidence that has been discovered. And sadly, it was knowingly fictitious. On the back side of the poster is a note from the publisher that states that although proto-apes and apes were quadrupedal, walked on all four, all are shown here standing for comparison. It was known that at the time the poster was produced, that the proto-apes and apes that are shown here on the poster did not walk on 2 legs. They walk on 4 legs. And when they walk on 4 legs, they're what we call knuckle walkers. They knew that they didn't walk on 2 legs. But they're not just shown standing for comparison. They're shown walking with very human-like gaits. Thus, it became known as the March of Progress, because they're shown marching ahead into progress. The fact is that humans are significantly different from apes. Morphologically, again, apes are quadrupeds. They are knuckle walkers. Humans are bipeds, walking on 2 legs. And the entire skeletal system of these two reflects this difference. For example, humans have a straight S-shaped back, which is ideal for upright posture of a biped because the torso and the head are directly above the hips in a standing position. Apes have the curved, what they call a C-shaped back, as you can see from this diagram. Other important differences: we have an upright skull. The position at which the spinal cord enters the skull is located at the bottom of the skull in humans and on the back of the skull in apes. We also have fully extendable hips and angled femur bones. When looking from the front, humans have femur bones that are angled inward as they come down from the hips. This has the effect of making the knees and feet close together, nearly under the center of the body, giving stability during walking and running. During walking and running, the body is supported only by 1 leg at any instant, and so the body can topple over if the legs are not right underneath the body. And there are other differences as well. such as fine balance. We have a complex inner ear, more to complex inner ear design than apes. We have a flat face, so that the eyes have a wide field of view, which extend down to the ground in front of the feet. Fully extendable knee joints. We have very long legs. The legs of a human is about half the total body length. This makes it possible to walk and run for long distances with relative ease. And the arched feet, very, very important. The human foot is arched because the ball of the foot and the toes, the foot has around 26 bones and has many muscles and ligaments, tendons and nerves, so the foot can flex between the heel and the ball. The arch structure of the foot makes it easy for a person to press down on the ball of the foot, which is important for balance and control. This ability is also important for movements such as standing on tiptoe, running, and turning. We also have that strong big toe that apes do not have. Apes have a toe designed for grasping. Humans have a strong big toe. This feature is important for both, again, walking and running. For each step, the final push from the ground comes from the big toe. In order to propel the body forward in a controlled manner, the big toe must be very strong. Almost all of the anatomical differences between the two are due to the different methods in which we stand and walk. Bipeds versus quadrupeds, the differences are significant. And taxonomically, we can see these differences as well. Now, all the various ape-men, this is what we want to look at. We want to look at these supposed ape-men, these transitional forms between apes and humans. There's a number of them that have been put forward. But all of these, not all, but the vast majority of these have been reassigned following their discovery to one of two genera. So a taxonomic level of classification referred to as a genera. We have the genus Australopithecus. All of the species that have been assigned to Australopithecus are referred to collectively as Australopithecines. Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus. A number of species have been assigned here. And then we have another genus, the genus Homo, in which Homo sapiens belong, our own species. There are other ape-men that have been assigned to this genus as well. Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalis, for example. And there have been others. Many other species have been found, not listed here. Homo ergaster, Homo antecessor, Homo heidelbergensis, floresiensis, rudolfiensis. I could go on and on. Many different species have been found. Oftentimes, though, when a species is discovered and named by its discoverer, it later is reassigned to one of these already existing groups. One of the big debates today in paleoanthropology is between like two groups they refer to as the lumpers and the splitters. Literally, there are groups called lumpers and splitters. Lumpers would reassign all of these ape-men to the groups we already have, to Homo erectus, for example. Vast majority of the claims of ape-men have been reassigned to Homo erectus or to one of Australopithecines. The splitters want to make any discovery of new species. If you discover a human fossil and claim that it's a new species, boom. You're not only on the front page, you're famous if you discover something new. But if you discover, the 400th Homo erectus fossil, then, no big deal. Not going to become famous by discovering another piece of Homo erectus fossil, but you discover something new. Some subtle anatomical difference that seems significant could allow the discoverer to claim that it's a separate species. Because the difference between one species and another, other than reproductive compatibility, are morphological or anatomical differences. So you find some fossil that has some subtle anatomical differences. You claim it's a new species that rewrites the story of human evolution. Boom, you're famous right off the bat. Famous, front page, get yourself a job at universities and teaching positions. The easiest way to become famous today is to discover something new, not just one of the same old, okay? But within the creation science community, these two genera are generally regarded as containing true apes, Australopithecines. We're going to look at Australopithecines, we're going to look at Homo erectus, we're going to look at Neanderthals, but just to summarize, that the genus Australopithecines, the genus Australopithecus, are believed to just be apes. The members of the genus Homo are believed to be humans, and we'll talk about these. There are differences. Are the differences significant? What do they tell us about them? And I have intentionally overlapped these circles over Homo habilis because many argue that Homo habilis is actually a mixture of ape and human fossils. Okay? But this goes to explain also how you make an ape-man. Where did all these ape-men come from? There's several ways you can make an ape-man and claim that it's a transitional form between ape and humans. And this is how you make an ape-man. One of them, like they made Homo habilis, is that you combine ape fossils and human fossils and declare the two to be one individual. Then you have a real ape-man. Other thing you could do is emphasize human-like qualities of fossilized apes, like the Australopithecines. You start making drawings of them that make them look more human-like. With some creative imagination, you could upgrade these apes to be more human-like. You could do the opposite, too. You could emphasize ape-like qualities of fossilized humans. And with some imagination, you can downgrade your humans to be more ape-like. These are how, these three ways is how all of the ape-men have been created. Most of them are just imagination. So we want to look at these one at a time. Well, first we're going to look at the Australopithecines. You know, the truth is here that there's an enormous gap between apes and humans, and I want to try to emphasize that, but I'll state it from the beginning, okay? Australopithecines, take a look at Australopithecines. There are a number of Australopithecines that have been discovered over the year. The Tong skull, Mr. and Mrs. Plez, and one called the Nutcracker Man. There's Australopithecus africanus, but I'm going to focus on Australopithecus afarensis. Australopithecus afarensis was made famous by the first discovery in 1974 of the fossil that later became known as Lucy. And there's actually a story behind that. Apparently, in the camp, the night after its discovery, they were playing the Beatles. And the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, came on, and someone had the bright idea of calling their new discovery Lucy. True story about how Lucy got its name, okay? It was discovered by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia in 1974. It was claimed to be about 40% complete, but because they did not include the bones for the hands and feet as part of that, it's actually closer to 20% complete. And again, this is back in 1974. They found much of the rest of Australopithecus afarensis since then, and it was claimed to be a biped. But again, and although the hands and feet are missing from that is the actual bones of Lucy, most of the rest of them have been found since. But a number of reproductions have been made of Lucy, all of them looking very ape-like. And Lucy was very short. We're talking about 4 feet or less. Very, very short. This is Australopithecus afarensis reconstruction of the Las Vegas Natural History Museum. Here's another at the Maxwell Museum of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico. Another reconstruction. Lucy actually came to the Pacific Science Center a few years ago. The actual bones of Lucy came to the Pacific Science Center. The exhibit was called Lucy's Legacy. I took my apologetics class from Cedar Park Christian Schools to see the exhibit back in 2009. It was a great exhibit, but there were a couple of observations I will note. One of them was, again, I mentioned that Lucy, the original discovery, was only about 20% complete. But since then, they've discovered most of the rest of the bones. Not all of them, but most of the rest of the bones. And usually what they will show you is a reconstruction wherein the bones that have been found are one color and the bones that have been filled in are a slightly different color. So you can see clearly in the reconstruction what parts are real and what parts are filled in. But nowhere did they have such a reconstruction. Nowhere did they have the skeleton. With the pieces that had been discovered up to that point, nowhere was that present, which I thought was an odd omission. But the other thing, kind of a cool thing. Now, this was an exhibit that was allowed by the Ethiopian government. Lucy was discovered in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopian government, in order to take Lucy on tour and use it for exhibits, they required that the exhibit also include a history of Ethiopia, which was almost entirely the Christian heritage of Ethiopia. which I thought was pretty cool. And this exhibit that's all about evolution, suddenly you're in a Christian Heritage of Ethiopia section. The churches that they've carved out of stone, literally take a hill and just carve a church out of a hill. So what's left is a church that's made out of solid rock. I thought it was pretty cool. Okay, this other construction, take a look at this reconstruction that's at the Living World exhibit at the St. Louis Zoo. And note that the afarensis reconstruction is shown here with a very human-like posture, even walking with a human-like gait, both arms and legs, very, very human-like. And notice in particular, the very human-like hands and feet. And she's even shown here with a very pensive gaze, right? Pondering the fate of her species. What will she discover? Will she make a meaningful impact? Did we come from outer space? What is she pondering? Who knows? However, prior to this exhibit, prior to the construction of this model of Australopithecus afarensis, the hands and the feet had been found. They weren't present in the original Lucy, but they had found most of the bones of the hands and feet, and extensive studies of them had already been done and shown conclusively that they did not have human-like hands and feet. In 1983, Jack Stern and Randall Sussman, a paleoanthropologist at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, compared the fingers and toes of afarensis to other apes and humans and published their work in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. They state that a summary of the morphological and functional affinities of the Hadar hand fossil leads inexorably to an image of a suspensory adapted hand, meaning a hand designed for hanging, surprisingly similar to hands found in the small end of the pygmy chimpanzee, common chimpanzee range. Meaning, if you take all the chimpanzees and line them up, smallest to biggest, afarensis is even closer to the pygmy chimpanzee side of the chimpanzee spectrum than on the common chimpanzee side. Now, they actually believe that afarensis was a transitional form to humans. They actually believe it was an ape they even believe it walked upright. But they make several startling discoveries here. They continue, they say there is no evidence that any extant primate has long, curved, heavily muscled hands and feet for any purpose other than to meet the demands of full or part-time arboreal life, for living in trees. They state elsewhere that they believe they walked upright, but their conclusions seem to say the exact opposite. The shoulder socket of afarensis is also very, very ape-like. It's sharply angled. Notice here that humans have a vertically oriented shoulder socket. The sharp angle of Lucy's socket indicates that they lived, again, an arboreal style life. Their shoulder sockets were designed for what's called brachiation, swinging by the arms from branch to branch. That's what they're designed for. In the year 2000, it was reported that they also had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. Again, apes, when they're walking on the ground, the wrists lock into place and they walk along as what are called knuckle walkers. Anamempsis and afarensis, the latter represented by the famous skeleton known as Lucy, had wrists capable of locking the hands in place during knuckle walking. Notice that this was published in a Science News article titled "Lucy on the Ground with Knuckles." Because, Lucy in the sky with knuckles. Nothing, terrible. Terrible. This is a tough room. Their pelvic bones were also very similar to chimps. Humans have a very different pelvic bone arrangement that permit us to walk upright. Note specifically the iliac blade of humans goes front to back, whereas in the apes, the iliac blade flares out laterally. The orientation of the bones is very important, again, for maintaining posture while walking upright. Stern and Sussman noted this as well in their publication. They say, The fact that the anterior portion of the iliac blade faces laterally in humans but not in chimpanzees is obvious. The marked resemblance of Lucy to the chimpanzee is equally obvious. It suggests to us that the mechanism of lateral pelvic balance during bipedalism was closer to that in apes than in humans. So you have a fossil that you want to walk upright, but all of its anatomical features support a quadrupedal form of movement, walking around on knuckles. But you really want this fossil to walk upright. So what can you do? Maybe you could take your fossil into the lab, maybe do a little bit of reconstructive surgery on your fossil, take that quadruped ape and transform it into a walking biped. Maybe that's what you could do. And you might think I'm being facetious about this, but this is exactly what C. Owen Lovejoy did. He is the chairman of anthropology at Kent State University, and watch what he decides to do in this 1994 PBS Nova series.
The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea. We needed Owen Lovejoy's expertise again, because the evidence wasn't quite adding up. The knee looked human, but the shape of her hip didn't. Superficially, her hip resembled a chimpanzee's, which meant that Lucy couldn't possibly have walked like a modern human. But Lovejoy noticed something odd about the way the bones had been fossilized.
When I put the two parts of the pelvis together that we had, this part of the pelvis has pressed so hard and so completely into this one that it caused it to be broken into a series of individual pieces which were then fused together.
So he sees his pelvis, and the pelvis doesn't look like the pelvis of a biped. And so he concludes, well, it had to have got, modified somehow or another. So maybe it broke, and after death, something stepped on the fossil there, and then later the bones, and then later was fossilized together in a way that made it look like a biped's pelvis. So he decides to fix it.
This has caused the two bones, in fact, to fit together so well that they're in an anatomically impossible position.
To walk upright, that is.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle.
Got a big hole in it.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
The skull of Lucy is also extremely ape-like. Specifically, the face of apes and humans is completely different. Apes have what is called a shovel face. The face of humans is very, very flat by comparison. And you can see here the sloping face of Afarensis. The canine teeth also come in at an angle, unlike humans, which come in more straight down. The cranial capacity of Afarensis is even smaller than the typical ape, and it doesn't have nasal bones that humans possess. The jawbone of Lucy is also much more similar to that in chimps and humans. Also, the skull, the point of attachment of the spine, which in humans is close to the center, but is below the skull, close to the center, allowing upright posture, is even further back in Afarensis on the skull than it is in chimps. Australopithecines also had the same semicircular canal for balance control that apes have, and they have the large external ear hole like the apes, typical of knuckle walkers. And for decades, these ape-like features have been known and noted by world-renowned scientists. For example, in 1958, Ashley Montague, who was a British-American anthropologist who taught at Harvard, Princeton, Rutgers, University of California, he denied that Australopithecines was a human ancestor. He says, the skull form of all Australopithecines is extremely ape-like. The Australopithecines show too many specialized and ape-like characteristics to be either the direct ancestor of man or of the line that led to man. In 1970, Lord Zuckerman, who was a professor of anatomy at Birmingham University in England and the chief scientific advisor for the British government, stated, I find myself totally unpersuaded. Almost always, when I have tried to check the anatomical claims on which the status of Australopithecus is based, I have ended in failure. Listen to this. He said the Australopithecine skull is in fact so overwhelmingly simian as opposed to human that the contrary proposition could be equated to an assertion that black is white. That's how far away they are from being a human ancestor. But again, it's not the evidence that's convinced most people that humans evolved from apes. It's not fossils. It's not even fossils that have been seriously modified to make them walk upright. But it's illustrations that have convinced most people. Because the illustrations, the reconstructions that we get are not actual. The vast majority of them have been seriously altered. And you can find the artists making admissions to this. For example, this was a construction published in National Geographic in 1996, shown right here. And it has several features that are very human-like. You kind of have to compare apes and humans. One of them that jumps right out at me are the whites of the eyes. You may have never noticed, but no apes have whites in their eyes like that. It's a distinctly human-like trait. But the artist who made this reconstruction admits that it's not an actual reconstruction. Listen to this. He says, I wanted to get a human-like soul into this ape-like face to indicate something about where she was headed. It's not a true-to-form reproduction. He made it look more human-like. Admits that. I wanted to get a human-like soul into that ape-like face. So instead of it being an actual reproduction, it's one that suggests where she's headed. It's closer to humans than to ape. Remember, you exaggerate the human-like qualities of fossilized apes to make an ape-man. That's what they do. Australopithecines, very ape-like. They have a brain size that overlaps chimpanzees. Jaws are similar to chimpanzees. The long arms are identical. The upper leg bone is similar. Large back muscles for tree dwelling. Hands similar to the pygmy chimpanzees. Ape-like foot. Fingers and toes are long and curved. Locking wrists for knuckle walking. And the ankle bone for tree dwelling, very ape-like. Charles Oxnard is arguably the world's foremost expert on the computerized analysis of bones using digital technology. He's the former professor of anatomy and anthropology at the University of Chicago and currently at the University of Western Australia. He said, Australopithecines are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism, possibly from a place in a group any closer to humans than to African apes, and certainly from any place in the direct human lineage. But have they been? Have they been removed? Although the evidence strongly argues against them being a transitional form, until they have something better to take its place, they will stick with what they have. Australopithecines will remain until they have something better to take its place. Australopithecines, true apes. But we want to look at a couple of these ape-men that are classified into the genus Homo. Specifically, we'll look at Homo erectus and Neanderthals. And we'll start first with Homo erectus. The name means erect man. Homo erectus was first discovered in 1891. To date, more than 280 fossil individuals have been found that are identified with this group, although a lot of them were originally given a different name, thought they were separate species, eventually reassigned to Homo erectus. The first that was discovered was Java man, named after Java Island in Indonesia. This was the first fossil evidence to be discovered of what is now called Homo erectus, and it is arguably the best known human fossil in existence. and was the evidence that convinced a great many people that humans have evolved from apes. Illustrations and models like these were created in 1922 and were circulated for decades. Now, it was just kind of a side note on this. It was discovered by Eugene Dubois, who was a former student of Ernst Haeckel. You might not know who Ernst Haeckel was, but he was an evolutionist back during Darwin's day, he's probably best known for a fraud that he committed to support evolution. He had a bunch of embryos published that he claimed that that the embryos of various organisms all looked identical, all looked the same at the same stage of development. But later, and we're talking like in the 1980s, they finally overturned this and announced it as a fraud. That he knew that the embryos didn't look that way, but he published it anyway. Had some plates made up, some illustrations of what he claimed these embryos look like at these stages, and to prove evolution. People will go to great lengths to prove evolution. But Eugene Dubois was a student of Ernst Haeckel. And he went out specifically to try to find human fossils, to find ape-man fossils. What he discovered was a skull cap, a femur, and a single tooth. There was no jaw or point of attachment to justify the ape-like reconstruction. Often what they find is just a skull cap. They might find a jaw also, but what they often don't find is the rest of the face, the bones of the face, that show where the jaw attached to the skull. And who was it? Was it Marvin Lubenow, I believe, in his book, Bones of Contention, state that he had seen these paleoanthropologists literally comparing the skull cap with the jawbone to try to figure out where it kind of fit. And if the jaw is more forward, it looks like an ape. If the jaw is further back, it looks like a human. But if all you have is the skull cap and the jaw, then it's up to the artist, to the scientist, to argue where the jaw fits. And if he believes it was more ape-like, the jaw fits forward. If he believes it was more human-like, the jaw fits backward. Here's the actual bones shown here in a display case. Now, he actually found, this discovery was contested for some time. In particular, the skull cap and the femur were argued to have belonged to different individuals. And that may rightfully be true. The skull cap was what they call robust. And one of the big differences between Homo erectus and modern Homo sapiens is the thickness of the bones. And not just of the skull cap. The bones are generally thicker in these fossils. The skull cap that they found of Homo erectus that Eugene Dubois found was very robust, meaning thick. But the femur that they found was gracile, which means it had the thinner kind of bones of a modern human. So because of these differences, it was argued from the very beginning that they did not belong to the same individual. And that very well may be true. But other Homo erectus fossils have been found. Other parts of the anatomy have been found. The next most important discovery was called Peking Man, who was discovered outside of Beijing, China, which was at that point called Peking, or at least by us. They was discovered in the Sakutian cave system, the entrance of which is shown here. It was this cave system was announced as a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in 1987. Now look at the statue out front. I just kind of crack up when I see this. You know, I have to think, what would that, you know, they found several fossils in this cave system. They actually went back into it later and did more digs. But I have to just think, what would that guy think, that poor fellow that they dug up out of that cave system, what would he think if he went back to his cave system in the future and found this big statue sitting out front? You know, go back, they were worshiping me like I was a god, you know? But it almost is a veneration that we're doing here, you know, the way we treat these discoveries. Treat this cave system like it's venerated. Good grief. That poor guy. Now, these are the replicas of 6 skull caps that were discovered in the Sakutian cave system, and all we have is the replicas. All we have is the replicas of the original Peking Man skull caps, because the originals were lost during World War II. When Japan was invading, kind of interesting story behind it all. When Japan was invading, China decided to turn them over to the Americans for transport to some safe location. And the servicemen that they gave these skulls caps to disappeared and ended up in an internment camp later. No one really knows what happened to the skull cap. Presumably they were captured on the road at some point, heading down to the shipping docks. And, the Japanese, assuming the Japanese who had captured them, probably looked in the back of, expecting to find a bunch of machine guns or something and open it up and there's a bunch of bones. He's got American servicemen hauling bones for them over here, hot tamale. So anyway, they were lost. And as recently as like 2015, the Chinese government was trying to revive interest in them to see if they could find them once again. Now, Eugene Dubois, this is kind of a little side story here, but some have claimed that Eugene Dubois, who remember found Java Man, it has been claimed that Eugene Dubois actually recanted and claimed that his discovery was actually a giant gibbon, was actually an ape. But, and he is largely responsible for this story, but he was actually trying to counter arguments that Java Man was the same as Peking Man, because they were recognizing that they were similar, and it had been argued that Java Man was another fossil similar to Peking Man, and to make his unique, he started arguing that it had more ape-like characteristics, more similar to a gibbon. But in order to be famous, you have to have the fossil, Can't be just one of the fossils, after they have a whole bunch of Homo erectus fossils, you're no longer going to be famous. So, but he didn't recant. He believed that what he had found was an ancestor of humans. Homo erectus fossils have now been found at numerous sites. This map shows you, the red dots show you where Homo erectus fossils have been discovered. Across Africa, Europe, Asia, many different sites. And there's an interesting tool that's been found with them, or at least it was interesting to me. Sometimes when you do these kind of things, you find something that seems interesting and, maybe later it's not so interesting and take it out. Anyway, they found a tool that they call a hand axe. And this map, actually the browned out area of this map shows you where they have found hand axes. And there's even a heritage park in England with a hand axe monument there because of hand axes that have been found. This is what the hand axes look like, okay? And about how big they are, which is why they're about, it definitely looks like a tool. It's been tooled, it's been chiseled down, and it would fit in a hand, and so that's why they've been called hand axes. But there's actually a significant debate about what they were used for. What are they? And the reason why they were probably not hand axes is if you look closely, these things are tooled all the way around. They're edged all the way around. And if you were going to use this as a hand axe, you would definitely have one side of it really flattened off, or else it's going to cut into your hand. So many people do not believe that these were used as a hand axe, and it doesn't look like they were even attached to something like a handle, because there's just not an obvious point of attachment, a rounded off edge that you would use to attach to something. Marvin Lubenow, I'll introduce you to Marvin Lubenow with a couple of quotes here later. He has a book titled Bones of Contention. And in his book, he argued that these were probably something that they threw at prey. And he made an interesting connection between these and these hand axes and the discus event, that's the competition that's used in the Olympics. And he made a point that, the vast majority of these athletic competitions are based on some skill that we develop either during work or war or something of the sort. And you can point, like you look at the javelin, jousting, they do these lumberjack competitions. Have you seen these lumberjack competitions on TV? But if you look at the discus is just kind of odd. What were people doing that caused them to become skilled throwing something like that eventually led to a competition? And he argued that maybe this was it, that maybe these were thrown discus style. And I even found a similar write-up on Wikipedia. They described it as a super frisbee, but perhaps thrown as discus at prey. That's just at least one explanation for what these were. But Homo erectus, there are some differences, but the differences are not so significant, okay? Most of the distinguishing characteristics are related to the thickness of the bones. Again, they have the thick, robust bones in the skull, slightly smaller than average cranial capacity. They also had thick brow ridges, thick ridges over the brow. Some other things, they have this occipital bun is an enlargement kind of on the back of the skull. The occipital lobe is in the back, and so it's kind of a enlarged. The sagittal ridge mentioned there is a small crest, small ridge on the top of the skull. So the skulls are a little bit different, but the big difference was the thickness of the skull. Otherwise, not too significantly different. If you start looking for reconstructions, you will find some reconstructions that have them looking extremely ape-like, but as time has gone on and more bones have been found, more and more complete skulls were found, the reconstruction started getting more and more human-like. This is a reconstruction at the Museum of Natural History in Vienna. Very human-like. Another that was made for the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. This reconstruction of a male is based on a skull that was discovered in Indonesia. That is the most complete Homo erectus skull that they found so far. And so with a very complete skull, they were able to make a fairly accurate reproduction. And notice that the jaw is not forward. Now that they find the skull and know the point of attachment of the jawbone with the skull, they have the jaw back like it is in modern humans, not forward like they do in some of the reconstruction. If you look again, I'm going to show you again the original. Look at Java Man's original reconstruction. Look how far forward the jaw is on Java Man. Big time different than the reconstructions we have now, that multiple bones of the skull have been found. Jaw is back like it is in modern humans. And you know, we can find people with many of these characteristics. The heavy brow ridge, for example, and one of the other I didn't point out too much is the fact that they don't have a very pronounced forehead. It's a very sloping forehead, not the flat forehead that a lot of us, but we can point to modern people today that have both of those characteristics. The sloping forehead, don't have the real pronounced forehead, and the brow ridges. In particular, in Eastern Europe, where both Homo erectus and Neanderthal lived, we can find peoples like this. Like, look at this guy. This is a Russian boxer by the name of Nikolai Valuyev. And you can definitely see the flattened forehead, this tapered forehead, and the thick brow ridges. We also see thick brow ridges in the Australian Aborigines. It's not an unusual characteristic, even for modern humans. We definitely see people like that today. But what about the thickness of the skull itself? Can that be used alone to distinguish Homo erectus fossils from modern Homo sapiens? Until recently, little data was present to actually make that conclusion. Meaning, if they found a skull with this thickness, we know it's not modern humans, it must be Homo erectus. Can they actually do that? Well, in 1994, finally a substantial comparison was conducted to determine if the cranial thickness, if the thickness of the skull itself could be used as a distinguishing characteristic to identify modern Homo sapiens against Homo erectus. And the conclusion was no. The summary was that now that comparable data is available, it appears clear that if Homo sapiens include all the people alive today in the world, their ancestors in the late Pleistocene, and those we call archaic Homo sapiens, then these two discoveries, Dali and Zhenjianu, then vault thickness cannot be used to distinguish Homo erectus from Homo sapiens. So although they have thicker skulls, it's not so thick, so different from modern Homo sapiens, that it can actually be used to distinguish them. Also, the cranial capacity. That was another significant difference. They have a slightly smaller cranial capacity than modern humans, but can that be used to distinguish them? It was thought in the beginning, but in 2008, I'm thinking, there was a discovery of a newborn Homo erectus, a Homo erectus pelvis was found that identified the size of the birth canal. And according to the discoverer, paleoanthropologist, at the Stone Age Institute and Indiana University in Birmingham, the Homo erectus infants could have had a head size of about 318 millimeters in circumference, which is right at the lower end of the spectrum of modern humans, whose newborns have a size between like 320 and 370. So even cranial capacity does not allow us to distinguish modern Homo sapiens from Homo erectus. Okay? We want to look at Neanderthals too. Neanderthals. So, Neanderthals are called Neanderthals because they were discovered in the Neander Valley near Dusseldorf, Germany in 1856. And they were believed to have lived between 600,000 years ago and 30,000 years ago, and were thought to be very ape-like. Look at this original drawing of Neanderthals. Very, very, very ape-like. Now, the Neanderthals inhabited most of Europe south of the line of glaciation during the Ice Age. Now, your creation scientists that hold to a biblical flood model believe that the Ice Age was caused by the global flood, that it actually happened at the very end of the global flood. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, caused the oceans to become very warm as the waters recessed off the continents. What you had is a condition with very warm oceans, colder continents, creating a perfect environment for lots of evaporation out of the ocean that fell out onto the continents, creating this ice age, okay? And during the ice age, the glaciers advanced to the 50th parallel north, which is at the very northern edge of that green patch right there. So the Neanderthals lived in the habitable areas just south of the Ice Age glaciers in a very harsh climate. They were also big game hunters, big game hunters. They had the thick brow ridges like your Homo erectus, kind of short, stocky body build, very stocky. And like I said, big game hunters. If you've ever seen them on movies hunting things like mammoths, they actually hunt mammoths. We found numbers of graves at this point of Neanderthals with trophies, including mammoth, artifacts in there. So they're definitely big game hunters. But again, some of the early reconstructions of Neanderthals had them looking very ape-like. And again, the way that they do this oftentimes is just to manipulate the point of attachment of the jaw with the skull. In his book, Buried Alive, Jack Cuozzo was a retired orthodontist, if I remember correctly, orthodontist dentist, who, because of his credentials as a physician, was able to gain access to Neanderthal skulls over in Europe, in both Germany and France. Actually went there with a portable x-ray machine and was able to gain access to some of these fossils and actually x-ray some of them. Well, while they're doing work on Neanderthal skulls, he found this drawing of a Neanderthal fossil at the souvenir counter at the museum in Berlin, which had a very ape-like face on a famous teenage Neanderthal that had been discovered called the Le Mosier. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct. Never had. Okay? But he noticed right away, as a retired orthodontist, that the jawbone in this diagram was fully out of socket. Okay? The extension on the jaw, a part called a process, actually fits into a little groove in the skull called a fossa. And he saw noticed right away in this diagram, that the jawbone is way out of socket. It's intentionally been moved forward, and been moved forward about an estimated 30 millimeters. And by moving it forward, you give it a very ape-like face. Move it forward, you got ape-like, shovel face. Move it back, so you got a flat face, very human-like. And he noticed right away that this figure had been distorted by moving the jaw forward. Because if you put it back where it's supposed to be, same skull, has a very human-like face. I found this picture on Wikipedia and noticed the exact same thing. This is actually a Homo erectus skull cap, but and then just a model or reconstruction of a jaw sitting there next to it, but it's also out of the fossa, which is probably about 10 to 20 millimeters at least to the backside, but they have it shifted forward as well, because when you move it forward, looks more ape-like. You shift it back, looks more human-like. So I even found one doing the same thing on Wikipedia. Neanderthals, though, now are looking very human-like, very human-like. I'll show you a few reconstructions. This one's at the Neanderthal Museum in Mettmann, Germany. Here's another from the same museum, Neanderthal Museum, very human-like. And another of the famous Gibraltar child, very human-like. Eric Trinkus is an anthropologist at Washington University and an expert on Neanderthal biology and human evolution. He says detailed comparison of Neanderthal skeletal remains with those of modern humans have shown that there is nothing in Neanderthal anatomy that conclusively indicates locomotor, manipulative, intellectual, or linguistic abilities inferior to those of modern humans. Visodero is a human anatomist with 3 books on surgical techniques. He said, despite their stocky body build and their stocky skull shape, there is no hard evidence to say that Neanderthals were in any way inferior intellectually to modern man. They are known to have made sophisticated flint tools. They built huts out of animal skins. They had control over fire, and they also buried their dead. Very artistic, too. Had made jewelry, lots of cave paintings. Number of cave paintings that have been discovered at this point is enormous. But the fact that they buried their dead is significant, because burying your dead is a very human-like quality and a very religious quality. Most people that bury their dead do so for religious purposes. And as Marvin Lubenow mentions here, probably the most significant evidence to support that Neanderthals are just humans is the fact that they have found modern humans and Neanderthals buried together. He says, most anthropologists recognize burial as a very human and very religious act. But again, the strongest evidence that Neanderthals were fully human and of our own species is that at 4 sites, Neanderthals and modern humans were buried together. Recently, genetic studies have been done as well that found that Neanderthals have interbred with modern humans. The Neanderthal genome sequence was completed in 2009 by the Max Planck Institute, and comparisons between the Neanderthals and several modern Homo sapien populations were included in the study. They compared them with Africans, French, Chinese, and Papua New Guineans. And their findings were published in 2010 in the journal Science. They found that Neanderthal-specific DNA markers in the genomes of all 4 modern ethnic groups except Africans, confirming that they had interbred with these groups. But they note one puzzling thing about this, in that is no archaeological evidence has ever been found of Neanderthals in China or Papua New Guinea, and yet they found Neanderthal DNA markers in those populations. Interesting. 99.7% of the base pairs of the modern human and Neanderthal genomes are identical. This was the first solid genetic evidence that modern humans or Homo sapiens interbred with Neanderthals. They were fully human. The original reconstructions, terribly inaccurate, terribly inaccurate. They're not ape-like, they're very human-like, 100% human. Brain capacity is even slightly larger than average for modern Homo sapiens. They used jewelry, they also used musical instruments, they made cave paintings, buried their dead, interbred with modern Homo sapiens. They were just humans. So who were these? Okay, I wanted to give you an answer for this. If Australopithecines are true apes, and your Homo erectus and Neanderthals are true humans, then how do they fit into the biblical timeline? We want to make sure I give you an answer to this in the brief amount of time I have left. Okay, first I want to point you to some theories, okay? And this is a good way to do it, just looking, hopefully you can read this diagram, look at how the evolutionary sequence has been changed through time. In 1955, all of these figures place Australopithecines as being the most ancient ancestor of modern humans that had probably evolved in Africa at some point. So Australopithecines evolved in Africa, that evolved into Homo erectus, and Homo erectus then evolves into modern Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, 1955. By 1967, it had been modified so that Homo erectus evolved into Neanderthals, and Neanderthals evolved into modern Homo sapiens. Just showing you how things have changed through time. 1971, again, Australopithecines in this case, evolved into Homo habilis. And then Homo habilis evolved into two separate species, Homo erectus and Homo sapiens. And Homo erectus evolved into Neanderthals, but Neanderthals weren't part of the human lineage at that point in history. Then they're back in human history. In 1980, again, Australopithecines into Homo habilis, into Homo erectus. And at this point, Neanderthals were considered a subspecies of modern Homo sapiens. They were actually given the scientific name Homo sapiens neanderthalis, a subspecies of modern Homo sapiens. The theories have changed through time, but there's one of the big changes was between two competing theories called the multi-regional and out of Africa theory. The multi-regional theory works like this. Australopithecines, again, were believed to have evolved in Africa, and then, so you see your color codes here, Africa, Europe. Sorry, this is the best diagram I could find for this. I know it's not great. Okay, so Australopithecines evolved in Africa, like, more than a million years ago. Then after the Australopithecines evolved into Homo erectus, the Homo erectus populations migrated to Oceania is Australia and the neighboring islands, Asia, Europe, and Africa, and then these Homo erectus populations continue to evolve over the next million years into Homo sapiens about 100,000 years ago. Okay, you see the way the diagram works? Hope, because not real good diagram. Okay, that's the multi-regional theory, which was the original theory. But more recently was put forth a theory that's called out of Africa theory, which is a little kind of odd. But so the out of Africa theory works like this. Australopithecines, same thing. Australopithecines evolve in Africa into Homo erectus in Africa. And then the Homo erectus populations migrate out to Australia and the neighboring islands, to Asia and to Europe, where they keep evolving. But the Homo erectus populations in Africa are the only ones that evolved all the way into Homo sapiens. And after they evolved in Homo sapiens, then the modern Homo sapiens evolved into these other areas. And the Homo erectus that were there, whatever, don't know what happened to them. But because we find Homo erectus populations in these areas, so a little weird, right? This out of Africa theory. Marvin Lubenow, in Bones of Contention, makes a really strong case for he believes, or at least at that time, that this theory was, the justification or motivation behind this theory was to get rid of the racial overtones that had long since been part of evolution. I mean, Darwin's second book, very kind of racial overtones there. And a lot of these populations, a lot of these various races have been viewed as subhuman. Your Australian Aborigines, for example. At one point, the United Kingdom literally paid people to go hunt down the Australian Aborigines, paid them prices for specimens to come back to their museums for study, and considered them lower humans. And so Marvin Lubenow argues that the justification for this theory might be just to bump the racial overtones, because if the individually Homo erectus populations have evolved in these various continents, then they could be evolving at different rates. But if the Homo sapiens migrated to these various continents, then they're all equivalent on an evolutionary scheme. Anyway, that's one theory. But the out of Africa theory, despite the odd nature of whatever happened to the Homo erectus populations in these other areas, got a significant boost from back in the late 80s, early 90s, from some mitochondrial DNA studies. And I don't know how many will remember what they called mitochondrial Eve. What they did was they studied mitochondrial DNA of populations from around the world. Now, most of your DNA is in the nucleus of a cell, but there's a little organelle in the cell called a mitochondria that also has DNA. And most of your mitochondria is inherited from your mother, because the egg cell is a lot larger than the sperm. It's going to have a lot more mitochondria. So most of your mitochondrial DNA comes from your mother, okay? And so what they did was they sequenced the mitochondrial DNA of peoples across the globe, and what they found was, at the time of this report, that all this mitochondrial DNA seems to have come from just one person. They called her mitochondrial Eve. And a lot of people heard this and sounded like good biblical alignment. Well, there's Eve. That works, mitochondrial Eve. But isn't it interesting? And they've also come up with these migratory maps due to this data. So I don't want to labor this much longer because I don't have much time left. But by studying these the mitochondrial DNA of populations around the globe, they've come up with not only this migratory map, and originally they claimed that the mitochondrial data showed that all these peoples had descended from one person, but later, further studies identified 3 separate mitochondrial lineages. And if you think about that, how many, assuming that Noah and his wife didn't have any more children, Noah's 3 sons had 3 wives from which all the various races descended after the flood. And that's what they discovered, that there were 3 separate mitochondrial lineages. On the map, if you'll see them, they're abbreviated L1, L2, and L3. That's what those represent. Nonetheless, how do these fit into the biblical view here? In general, these are believed to be post-flood populations. Post-flood. Okay? After Noah's flood, you end up with these populations afterwards. And several authors have commented on this. Marvin Lubenow, again, Bones of Contention. If you want a book that goes into this in some detail, I would recommend this. I've read several by several different authors, but Marvin Lubenow's Bones of Contention, a really good scholarly work covering this subject. He said, my own conclusion is that Homo erectus and Neanderthals are actually the same. One's just a little smaller than the other. He said, Homo erectus is on the lower end with regard to size of a continuum that includes Homo erectus, early Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. The range of cranial capacities for fossil humans is in line with the range of cranial capacities for modern humans. And he actually shows that modern Homo sapiens, by comparing the dates assigned to these fossils, he actually shows in his book, in this diagram that's on page 337, that modern Homo sapiens have actually been found contemporary or to coexist with not only all of your Neanderthals, but almost and all of Homo erectus, but pretty much with all of Australopithecines as well. How could Australopithecines have evolved into Homo erectus and then in Homo sapiens if modern Homo sapiens have always been there? They seem to be contemporary with all of these, just based on the dates that have been assigned to these discoveries. Peter Line states in Journal of Creation, he says, without the burden of having to fit fossils into an evolutionary scheme, there is no reason not to accept fossils such as those categorized as erectus and Neanderthals as belonging to the one humankind. If fossils such as those categorized as erectus and Neanderthals were all fully human, then the case for human evolution essentially collapses, as there is an unbridgeable morphological gap between the Australopithecine apes and these humans. Australopithecines are true apes, humans, true humans. So what about these differences? There are differences, the robust nature of the bones, etc. And a number of authors have spoken to this as well. Again, Peter Line from Journal of Creation mentions several things that could have contributed to the differences in the bone structures of the bones. Okay? He mentions greater genetic diversity and genetic drift within the humankind in the past. He mentions that they were living in a particularly harsh environmental condition, the Ice Age period, very harsh, very tough time to be living. He mentions dietary habits, nutrient deficiencies, perhaps, that could have contributed to the differences in the structures of these bones. He mentions stress of particular biomechanical forces. Specifically, he's referring to the differences in the shapes of the bones or thickness of the bones in the jaw region, mentioning that your bones are constantly growing throughout your life, but based on the stress you place upon them, they will be remodeled. And if you didn't have, back in Neanderthal Homo erectus days, if you didn't have a vice grip there, or a vice and some needle nose pliers or stuff, what do you use for tools? Well, you use your teeth, So if you need to grab hold of something real strong, if you're trying to make some cordage or strip some leather straps or something, you're going to put it in your teeth to hold on to it. and that kind of stress placed upon bones will cause those bones to be remodeled and thickened to accommodate that additional stress. Okay? Possible another factor. He also mentions, He also mentions pathology, diseases, such as those that could be caused by nutrient deficiencies, etc. Again, they were living at a particularly harsh time. Remember, after the flood, you wouldn't be able to farm right away because all the topsoil basically gone. It would take many, 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 many years for these, invasive plants to come in and start laying down new topsoil. At that point, you're nothing but hunting. But not good diets, potentially some problems related to that. But I think this is the most compelling: longevity. Longevity. Now consider this. Remember, before the flood, people lived to be like 800-900 years old. And it appears that reducing the human lifespan was one of the main intended consequences of the flood. Go back and read Genesis 6. When just before God says, I'm going to destroy the world by flood, he says, man shall not live but to 120 years old. He said, my spirit shall not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days shall be 120 years. I'm going to destroy the world by flood. He mentions that the humans will only live to 120 years just before he says he's going to destroy the world by flood. And interestingly, 120 is the medical max. The lifespans fell off, pretty consistency after the flood, until down to 120. Moses died at exactly 120 years of age, okay? Here's your actual lifespans as recorded in the Bible. I created this graph. It's kind of hard to read, but Adam, this is the original patriarchs. There's Methuselah. People may know he lived to be the oldest of any. There's Noah, and the lifespans of these fell off. Here's Moses right here, again, who died at exactly 120 years. There's the point of the flood. But it fell off gradually over several successive generations. Now, what would a person's skeleton look like? What would a person's bones look like who was 400 years old? Well, I don't really know. But your bones do continue to grow as long as you live. And this is a very compelling, I think, line of thinking to explain the differences in their bone structures from modern Homo sapiens. And remember, they found Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens found buried together. Maybe nothing more than you got one guy that's 300 years old buried in the same grave as someone that's only 30 years old. Maybe only the only difference you're looking at. Okay? But I want you to look at this map, though, one more time as I close out, okay? Because I think you're going to see something very interesting here. Again, this is one of the maps that was generated by their mitochondrial genomic studies, okay? That showed, remember that there were 3 mitochondrial lineages, but also shows the migration of these peoples across the globe, okay? Now, if we're correct about this, that Neanderthals and Homo erectus, which are, by the way, the difference in the yellow versus the brown there, the Neanderthal and Homo erectus, if these were people that lived after the flood, this is a kind of migratory pattern we're kind of expecting. And I want to point you to something interesting, and in particular, this junction point right there, okay, which is dead square in the Middle East. More importantly, I want to show you something. I'm going to put a little green circle up here to show you the location of Mount Ararat. That's Mount Ararat. But when did people really start migrating? After the Tower of Babel. Remember, people refused to. God told them to fill the earth and replenish it, okay? But they didn't. They went ahead and stayed right there. They started building this tower, to their own ego. And so God came down, created the various languages to scatter them. I want to put another circle up here to show you the location of the Tower of Babel, near as we can tell it, in northeastern Syria, right? Watch this. Is that pretty cool or what? When you see the scientific data illustrating how peoples have migrated across the globe based on these mitochondrial studies, and it's centered, the radiation point of this migration is centered square in the middle of where the Tower of Babel was. Isn't that cool? If we interpret scientific findings ourselves, consistent with the biblical worldview, it all makes sense. You can then place these ancient humans like Homo erectus, Neanderthals. It makes sense. We know that people did live to be much older than we do today. 400 years old. People are living to be 400 years old after the flood. And when we find their skeletons, we would expect to find some significant differences there. Very interesting, right? I'm going to show you one more reproduction of the March of Progress. Someone said that too. March of Progress. Now, you'll see those diagrams everywhere now, the March of Progress. Let me close out in a word of prayer. Remember that next week, Brian LaPointe is going to be here doing a talk titled Answer Evolution. Try to pull that slide back up for you. That's again next week, first Wednesday of each month. We always have a special guest speaker in. So Brian LaPointe is going to be in here doing a talk just on evolution. Okay, let me close out in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you so much, Lord. Father, we bow before you, and we ask for your blessing, Father. We ask for healing, blessings of healing, Father. We ask for wisdom, Father, wisdom to help us understand the science, understand how these findings should be interpreted, Father. Guide us to people for teaching that can guide us to the truth. To help us understand the true history of the world, Father, so that we can be a better witness for you. Give us wisdom to help us share the knowledge of creation, share the knowledge of your plan of salvation through your Son. Give us the knowledge to be able to share these things and address the many questions that would surface today so we can be a better witness for you, Father. Father, help us to become that person you want us to be, Father. We ask for conviction that leads to repentance, Father. We ask for healing, physical healing. We ask for wisdom, and we ask for conviction that would lead to repentance. Father, we praise you. We glorify and honor you. Praise the name of the Lord God. Praise your holy name, Father. We thank you so much. All things we pray and ask in Christ's name. Amen.